All right, everyone. So, as it was mentioned in my introduction, my name is Nicole. I am a fourth year political science international affairs major, and I'm going to be presenting my completed research on Romania and the EU, which is a process tracing analysis of public opinion on the national government, corruption, and European integration. Only a little bit of a mouthful. But here's my outline. So, as a process tracing analysis, I am looking at the whole democracy of Romania from its inception in 1990 to the present day. And so I've kind of established this kind of chronological segmentation that I'm going to be going through in my outline. So I'm just going to quickly go over my research questions, and then I'm going to do a brief introduction on Romania and international organizations, because I'm sure not all of us are poli-sci majors here. And then I'm going to talk about the fall of communism in Romania in the early 90s, and then the rise to the accession of Romania into the EU in 2007. Then I'm going to talk about the post-accession period, which is 2007 to 2017, and then the modern era, and then my conclusions and my findings from my research. And then I'm also going to mention that I use a lot of statistics and a lot of data. Pretty much all of it is either from the World Bank or the Eurobarometer, which is a survey taken by the EU biannually. And Romania has been pretty much involved in the Eurobarometer since 2004. So here I've got my research questions. So the first one is, how have the dynamics between Romania's national government and the EU influenced public opinion? And then the second one is, what have been the most prominent areas of contention between Romania and the EU? And then how have those changed over the years? So here's my brief introduction. So I've got the two main international organizations that I'm going to be discussing are NATO and the EU. So the North Atlantic Treaty Organization is mostly a military alliance, but it has political influences. It does include the United States, Canada, and Turkey, but it's mostly known for having a lot of European nations involved in it. And then it also emphasizes democratic values alongside peaceful resolutions to conflicts. However, it's also important to notice that they do have their own army, which is a very prominent feature that will pop up when I'm talking about why Romania wanted to get involved later. And then also then there's the EU. The EU is more of a political and more of an economic union, and this one is exclusively to European membership. And then various European member nations vote and establish a rule of law that is considered to be a supranational rule of law. So all of the members nations are expected to follow that, but then they also have their own national laws that they abide by. And then in case you don't know where Romania is, it's right on the Black Sea. It's pretty much as far east as you can get in Europe. And yeah. So now we get to the fall of communism. So here is kind of what Romania is most known for, aside from Dracula, is this man right here in the top left, Nicolae Ceausescu, and he's photoed alongside of his wife, Elena. So many political scientists explained that he had a neo-Stalinist form of government. He kind of developed a cult of personality, and he was the dictator of Romania from the early 60s to 1989. And then especially throughout the late 1980s, there was this kind of trend of depoliticization that occurred. More than 80% of the population of Romania was a member of the People's Communist Party. And it wasn't necessarily that they believed themselves to be communists, it's just that there were economic and social benefits of having that communist membership card, including many jobs that you could not get unless you were a member of the Communist Party. And then also in the late 80s in particular, there was this prominence of coercion and violence from the army and the secret police of Romania, also known as the Securitate. Those two were used to crack down on any sort of dissent in the population. As kind of the rise of Eastern Europe and kind of all of the falling of various communism nations throughout the Eastern Bloc were occurring, we saw this emergence of the National Salvation Front. And it was initially just started as an anti-Ceausescu movement, and it was actually largely made up of members of the Communist Party that Ceausescu ousted because they were becoming too popular or they had democratic tendencies. And they were a large movement that was underneath the Romanian Revolution in December of 1989. You can see their flag pictured here, which is literally the communist flag of Romania, but with the communist emblem just cut out. And that became a really big symbol. So in December of 1989, there was all sorts of revolutions that were occurring, and then Ceausescu and his wife were actually arrested. There was a military tribunal, and then they were executed on Christmas for crimes against humanity. And then this left Romania with a power vacuum. And it was established in May of 1990 that there would be elections. And then in April of 1990, it was established that the National Salvation Front would be its own party in these elections. Now, this became a bit concerning because the army and the Securitate were trying to avoid any sort of blame or any sort of involvement with the Ceausescu regime. So they allied themselves with the National Salvation Front towards the end of 1989. So when the interim government elections occurred in 1990, they were free, but they were not fair. That is widely established. The National Salvation Front was in charge of the state media. The Securitate and the army were both heavily involved in the National Salvation Front. And foreign observers were actually invited to witness the elections, but there was voter intimidation tactics present, there were ballot stuffing practices present, and you can kind of see this in the results. Is in the kind of graph at the bottom, 263 seats of the 330 seats of the Chamber of Deputies, which is the equivalent of the House of Representatives, were all National Salvation Front. And Ion Iliescu, who was a former communist himself, he won the presidency with 86% of the vote, which political scientists immediately raise an eyebrow and think that is suspicious because that should not be happening in democracies. But this kind of leads us to a transition period. Iliescu was actually in power. He did win again in elections in 1992, which it's debated if those were free and fair or just free but not fair as before. But the true kind of start of democracy in Romania occurs in 1996. And here we have a massive coalition between a lot of anti-communists and then also the Hungarian ethnic minority in Romania. And then they kind of rise to power. However, because all of their organizations were so scattered and so spread out, when they came to govern together, it was kind of sporadic and it didn't do quite anything good for Romania, unfortunately. By many Romanians, it was actually deemed too radical. These are people that many individuals, especially in the countryside, didn't see a flaw in communism. They just saw flaws in Ceausescu. So when you're kind of rapidly introducing market reforms and then you switch from supporting Serbia to supporting Kosovo and the Balkans, it's kind of like just a complete radical change, and a lot of Romanians didn't really like this. And then also these harsh economic reforms that they implemented, they were trying to move towards the market economy of the EU. However, they led to a kind of boom-bust economy that I'm going to show in the next slide. That was just an absolute nightmare for everyday Romanians to deal with. So what happens is in 2000, Iliescu returns. The center-right lost all of their credibility from their 4 years in office, and the main two leaders that were running for Romanian presidency were Iliescu and then also Cornel Vadim Tudor, who was a radical nationalist. So and so when he ran for president, pretty much all the ethnic minorities and all the people that were center or even left-leaning voted for Iliescu. So he won by a significant margin, I think around 60%. And then after this, it's kind of noted of Romania's struggle to accession. Economy was falling behind Central and Eastern European countries just because market reforms to get that EU economy were just not implemented well. There was also large concerns that the Hungarian minority, which I have shown in a graph in the bottom left, were being mistreated. And then this led to Romania's accession resulting in a safeguard clause. Romania was originally supposed to be a candidate, or Romania became a candidate in 1999, but they were supposed to become an actual member of the EU in 2004. they did not meet the qualifications to become a member in 2004. So instead, that was delayed until 2007. And then when it came time for them to become a member again, that only occurred because there was a safeguard clause implemented where if they didn't reach their actual goals by 2008, they would be kicked out of the EU. Romania and Bulgaria together in the safeguard clause, it remains the only safeguard clause to have existed in accession to the EU. Has not occurred before, has not occurred after. And here in the bottom, it shows a graph of actual EU member states showing their support or not support of Romania joining the EU throughout the 1990s. As you can see, for a significant portion of this graph, most of Europe was not in favor of having Romania join the EU just because it was deemed an unstable country. But eventually it did join the EU, as I mentioned, with its safeguard clause, right in time for the 2008 economic recession. So in the graph on the right, you can see the sort of boom-bust economy of the 90s that I mentioned earlier, to a country that at the beginning of the 1990s was around 60% in poverty. That economy was just incredibly like nuisance to deal with. But in the 2000s, it kind of stagnated a bit. And in the end, the 2008 recession didn't really impact Romania as much as it did Western European countries, which is also kind of interesting. And then in that period from 2008 to 2012, there were actually slow reforms to improve Romania's market economy, which actually ended up improving, as I'll explain later. However, in 2012, corruption allegations would begin throughout various members of not only national governments, but local governments and regional governments. A lot of these allegations started in 2010, but most of the convictions would occur between 2017 and 2019. And this would be incredibly kind of concerning for most Romanians, but also from the international perspective as well. And then this kind of established Romania as the underperforming EU country. There are many instances in which Romania is at the bottom of the list alongside Bulgaria, including like road quality, infrastructure quality. At this time, it was the economy growth, and there's just many, many factors. But this brings us to the modern era. So starting in 2017, we have these sort of more economic reforms, as you can see in the bottom left, is Romania's growth rate expected from 2018 to 2028. Romania is now the fastest growing economy in Europe. So while those reforms and implementations were slow at the beginning, they definitely picked up steam, especially in the last 5 years. However, the economic reform and the political reform are still two very different beasts. And in terms of political reform, it's still very dominated by the central elite. In 2017, there was a decriminalizing draft that was passed, and it was not passed in the traditional way. You can think of it more of like an executive order. And what it said was essentially that the government would not be looking into corruption scandals that involved less than 48,000 US dollars. This was widely criticized. It was, according to the people that passed, it was supposed to put less of a burden on the prison system. However, if you could see in the image in the top left, that is the largest protest that has occurred since the fall of the communist regime. And these protests actually lasted 2 years. Now, that draft was revoked 5 days after it was passed, but the protests still continued for another 1.5 years after that. Another political crisis that occurred was in 2021. The prime minister at the time, Florin Citiu, acted against his own governing coalition and pretty much fired the minister for justice. And what that led to was the political party that minister of justice was associated with pulled out of the governing coalition, which meant that governing coalition did not have a majority of the chamber anymore. And so pretty much the majority of the chamber voted against the acting government, and it pretty much led to a power vacuum again. And then it was kind of established that the two major parties at that point would kind of just work together for the next couple of years, actually until next year, until there would be proper re-elections again in 2024. And then Also, the most notable recent thing regarding Romania and the EU was that Romania and Bulgaria together were both blocked from joining the Schengen area. The Schengen area of the EU is an area where it's visa-free travel if you are an EU citizen. So essentially, you don't have to get stopped at the borders anymore if you're just going through. But they were blocked. The Netherlands voted against Bulgaria, and then Austria said that Bulgaria and Romania should kind of like stick together on this because their border is quite open. And so it's unclear if they're gonna apply again, but this is kind of the sort of view from the international community that Romania and Bulgaria have received in the past few years. Especially, it was more so like poignant that Croatia was accepted in the Schengen area, and Croatia actually started its candidacy for the EU after Romania and Bulgaria did. So it's kind of like there's this other country that's moving past you essentially. And then what's all of this leading to is that sort of depoliticization that was occurring in the late 80s is kind of starting to happen again. A lot of Romanians are seeing that regardless of what party is in power, what president is in power, the national government is just not reliant. It's not easy to be reliant upon because it's just unstable beyond belief. And what this led to is that in the 2020 elections that resulted in Florin Știu, it was the lowest voter turnout in Romanian history. Out of the registered voters in the country, only 30% showed up to vote for the president and parliament elections. If we consider low turnout in the US, largely the 2016 elections are an example of low voter turnout, that was 50%. So this is 20% worse. And then, through all of this, I have found various conclusions and findings. The first one is that corruption, and more specifically, the perception of corruption, has greatly impacted not only EU and Romanian relations, but also just Romanian public opinion in general. And then the second one is this hesitancy towards economic reform that lasted all of the 90s and the early 2000s has led to the economy being considered one of the most important factors in Romania by the public. Whenever Romania is questioned in the Eurobarometer, always like the main concern is economy or inflation. It's like always one or two, and those are switching. The third point is that hesitancy of reform, lingering communist sympathy, and an increase in corruption allegations has complicated the relations between EU and Romania. That can be seen in the Schengen decision, that can be seen in the 2012 corruption allegations, be seen a lot. The fourth point is that public perception of corruption is correlated with lower voter turnout in Romania. As I just mentioned, voter turnout only really started declining after 2013, which was after corruption allegations at all levels of the government started coming out and being open. And then the final point that I put on these slides was Romanians have always looked to the EU to provide stability, and that still continues to be the case, especially when the national government is as unstable as it is. So if you look at the graphs on the right, I'm going to go with the bottom right. This is the 2004 Eurobarometer results. Feeling more stable economically as a member of the EU and feeling more stable politically as a member of the EU. And then if you look at where Romania is on these graphs, Romania is 76% tend to agree on the economically stable if they were a member of the EU. And then 69% tend to agree that they would be more politically stable as a member of the EU. This is what Romania was kind of looking for when they wanted to join the EU, but it hasn't really happened yet. But I will mention that most of the reforms that have taken place in Romania have been a result of EU pretty much saying you need to do this. A couple of examples of this are in 2004. The secret police was still involved in the Ministry of Justice, and it only took the EU calling it out publicly at the European Parliament for Romania to change that. And there are various other instances of similar patterns. And then if we look at the top right, the line chart, these are do you trust the Romanian government and do you trust the European Union? And these are all the results from the Eurobarometer from autumn 2016 to the most recently released Eurobarometer in winter 2022. As you can tell, the Romanian government is not as trusted as the EU is from Romanians themselves, and a lot of this can just be attributed to everything that has occurred previously. Prior to 2010, the EU was around 70% and the national government was always around 50 to 60%. But as time went on, those lines just slowly started drifting farther and farther apart. But yeah, I think that's it. Sorry, I talked very fast, but I am trying to summarize about 30 years of politics in 15 minutes. But I'll go ahead and stop recording and then I'll leave it open if you guys have any questions.